What is the role of an Army historian and the purpose of an Army historical program? How does Army history improve unit readiness? For answers to these questions and more Army history insights, stay tuned.
Welcome to the U.S. Army History and Heritage Podcast, the official podcast of the United States Army Center of Military History. The Center of Military History writes and publishes the Army's official history, manages the U.S. Army Museum enterprise, and provides historical support throughout the U.S. Army.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. I'm Lee Reynolds, the Strategic Communications Officer for the Center of Military History. In this episode, we're examining the role of the Army Unit Historical Program. Joining me for this discussion is Mr. Charles R. Bowery, Jr., the Executive Director of the Center of Military History. Well, thank you, Mr. Bowery, for being here.
My pleasure.
So a little background on Mr. Bowery. He has been the Executive Director of the U.S. Army Center of Military History for about 8 years. Previously, he served on active duty for 23 years as an Army aviation officer, commanding at all levels from platoon through battalion, and serving overseas in Korea, Germany, Iraq, and Afghanistan. He is a published author, speaker, and battlefield staff ride leader, focusing on the American Civil War. And he taught military history at the United States Military Academy at West Point. All right, so Mr. Bowery, right there in your bio, you talk about you taught military history. So my understanding is there's different types of historians in the Army. So if you could talk about the difference between a teaching historian and an official historian.
Sure. The Army has hundreds of historians, both in and out of uniform, officers, NCOs, and civilians, and they fall roughly, as you said, into two categories. A number of these are teaching or instructional historians, and so they work within the Army's training and schools system. And those go all the way from the Department of History at the U.S. Military Academy, which teaches undergraduate cadets. They're basically undergraduate history courses. That extends to the service schools, which teach officers and soldiers of all ranks. And these schools will frequently have history instruction as a part of their program of instruction. And so these are platform instructors who teach history. The Combined Arms Center at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, actually has the most of these teaching historians of any installation in the Army, because a number of different entities teach history at Fort Leavenworth. For example, you have an entire Department of Military History as a part of the Command and General Staff College. You then have history instruction that goes on in the School of Advanced Military Studies as well. And so there are a lot of historians throughout the Army who occupy teaching roles. Mm-hmm. And then on the other side of the coin, you have what I call official historians, whose function is not to teach history classes, but is to maintain the Army's institutional memory by maintaining a record of Army activities over time and maintaining, archiving, and mobilizing this record to serve a staff function. So these are really individuals who offer decision support and information support to leaders who make decisions, and they inform policy. Really, every aspect of the Army's operations are informed by these official historians.
And where would we find these official historians?
They are resident in every echelon, in every Army command, throughout the Army. They're in many cases, they are the command historians for units of the Army, and we're talking mainly at echelons above the division level. So at the higher command level, you have historians in the various Army commands and activities away from the battlefield or away from the operational Army. You have historians in each of the three components: the active, the National Guard, and the Army Reserve. And then you have the Center of Military History, which is really a large historical office that serves at the HQ-DA level, Headquarters Department of the Army. So really they're up and down, and they're laterally across the Army.
Right, and are these historians usually active duty, Guard Reserve, or are they civilians, or are they a mix of both?
The answer is all of those things, and it depends on the type of organization and its manning structure. Some organizations will have a civilian historian who's a part of a TDA organization that supports an active unit. In some cases, these will be members of a staff. These will be officers or NCOs that are a part of a staff. And so that will depend on the particular component you're talking about.
These historians, they oversee an office. So what is an Army Historical Office, and what does it do for a command?
Our regulation, AR 870-5, which covers the Army Historical Program, is pretty specific that the functions of a historical office for a command of any echelon or level in the Army are pretty specific, and there are three of them. The first of those is to maintain a historical file. So these are the documents that document the unit's or the organization's history through time, and some more on what that's composed of later. The second function would be to author periodic historical summaries of the organization. And then the third is to be a presence for both decision support and professional development in the command. So those are really the three functions that our regulation specifies that are carried out by a historical office.
And why is it important for these units to have the historian? You talked about some of these things, but what does it really do for a command?
It does a lot of things that are just assumed in many cases just to be happening, but they don't really happen without historians. For example, in an active operational unit, the historian's files are critical to the maintenance of a unit's lineage and honors. The list of campaigns and conflicts in which the unit has served, the list of designations by which the unit has been named and recorded in the Army's rolls through time, the unit's awards and decorations. These are all maintained as a part of a historical file. Other functions that are critical really come down to offering the command the ability to answer questions about the past. And those questions can be related to a contingency operation, a combat operation, a particular tactic, technique, or procedure that the unit's called upon to execute. They can be questions regarding, well, why did we make that decision in the past? Where did this policy come from? All of those are really in the portfolio of a historical office. I like to think of the analog in civilian life would be that a historical office is sort of a miniature think tank. They have the ability to provide some deep expertise on different things and to augment the decisions and the staff capability of a staff which is usually focused on the present and the future. Right. They're less focused on the past.
Yeah, but those lessons from the past is going to be very important in informing their current decision making.
That's right, and it's not just a question of looking into the past and developing a checklist and says, if we're going to do this thing, let's find an example of it in the past and just do those things again, and we'll be successful. And that's where that's another area where the historian is a critical enabler for this learning process, because the historian injects a note of context into the past, and they're able to mobilize this past, if you will, to allow the commander to think creatively about it, to visualize the future, and to make better decisions.
Yeah, now there's different types of official historians that we have in the Army. So can you explain the differences between a command historian, unit historical offices, and military history detachments?
So what we're talking about here is really sort of the sharp end of the historical program, and this is where the Army keeps its own history. And you refer to three sort of different categories of these unit historians. We've talked a lot already about command historians, and these can be either officers or civilians who are assigned to a particular organization, and their portfolio is that unit's organization's history. The second category you talked about is a unit historical officer, or UHO, and this is a relatively new part of our program that we've developed over the past 3 years that seeks to assign officers or NCOs at lower unit levels. So really at the brigade and below level, we're seeking to assign an additional duty soldier to be a unit historical officer. And the UHO's function is less doing historical work than it is keeping records. So the UHO's function is to create and maintain a historical file for all of the subordinate units of a larger organization. So, for example, within a division, you'll have 3 or 4 brigades, and each of those brigades will have 2 or 3 or 4 battalions beneath. So, in a properly set up system, the brigade and each of the battalions would have unit historical officers, and their function is to assemble these historical files to be of use for a command historian who will be functioning at a higher level, at the division or the corps level, for example. And so the third category of these are military history detachments. And these detachments are units whose purpose is to provide an additional layer of historical coverage for the Army's contingency operations, wartime conflict operations. And they're not focused on a particular unit. Rather, they're focused on collecting information, historical information, in a particular theater of operations or a particular area of operations.
I know when I was in Iraq, there were several military history detachments around the country, and I remember that we also had the multinational forces. Iraq had a command historian, and that he would tap into those military history detachments. I don't know if we had the unit history offices or officers at the time. They may have, but I know that the command historians always worked with those military history detachments. So they do deploy. They're not just people that sit back in the rear.
No, these are correct. These are MTO units. So they are table of organization and equipment units that have a unit identification code. They are sourced. They are given a deployment order. They move into a theater of operations and they collect documents and oral history interviews from operations in that theater. And so those were the detachments that you dealt with. And these MHDs really do create, in large measure, what we would call the primary source base for writing of the Army's official history. And so these are operations orders. These are after-action reviews. These are commanders' correspondence, including emails. These are concept of operation briefings. These are execution orders. These are policy documents. These are strategic documents. All of these documents become the primary sources by which future historians will write about the Army in these conflicts. And the MHDs are really the first point of entry to collect those documents.
And these are oftentimes classified.
Correct. By and large, certainly in the 21st century, the majority of records created by Army units are classified. And so these detachments are really working in a classified environment, and they're using the information technology systems that we have at our disposal to collect those documents, to archive them, again, all behind the classified wall for future use once they are declassified in our unclassified official histories.
Yeah, so that was going to be my next question is if there's all these classified documents, what kind of challenges does that create to write at least a short history soon after an event, or do you have to wait till longer?
It creates incredible challenges to the writing of history because, as I said, the publications that we write on the Army's history are meant to be in the public domain. They're unclassified. And so the documents, the primary source documents that make up the source material for these manuscripts are originally classified. The authors who work on them have security clearances and they work on the documents in classified form. And so the initial draft of these official histories that they complete in many cases remains classified until the documents can be declassified. And so the declassification process is really a bottleneck in the business process, if you will, of creating one of these official history books. And that's a problem that we don't really have for historians who are writing in an earlier era, for example, like historians who are writing on operations in World War II or before. The documents have largely been declassified because they've passed that 25-year threshold by which documents are able to be reviewed and declassified. And so most of the records for earlier conflicts are already sort of in the unclassified domain. That's not the case for Army operations, particularly since 9/11.
And we mentioned that all these positions, these official historians, military history detachments, they're in both the active force and the reserve National Guard. But if somebody wants to become a historian, if somebody wants to do this, at what point in their career can they do that, and what are the requirements?
The complement of military history detachments, as you said, is split between the three components. But the bulk of them, so 29 or 28 of the 39 military history detachments in the Army inventory are in the Army Reserve. 2 of them are in the active component, and the remaining 7 are in the Army National Guard. And so the short answer is that if you want to be an Army field historian in uniform, you're going to be either in the Army Reserve or the Army National Guard, and you will you'll need to have ideally a background in history. So an undergraduate degree in history would be sort of the first step. But almost as important as historical expertise for a military history detachment is operational expertise. So the ability to understand and visualize military operations, familiarity with terms and graphics, with staff procedures, all of those things, and then all the basic soldier skills of being a soldier in a wartime operational area or a contingency operation, all make up the skill set of a field historian.
Yeah, because this is not a branch.
Right.
You want
Correct.
historians, whether they're officers or senior or NTOs, I guess I should say, to have that experience of soldiering, so that they better understand what they're collecting.
That's correct, because they have to arrive in a theater of operations as a part of a 2 or 3 soldier detachment. They have to fall in on a headquarters or a series of units in a theater of operations. They have to then be able to integrate with staffs and execute what we call a collection plan, which is their plan of the documents that they seek to gather and collect and archive that will tell the fullest possible story of the Army's operations in that zone.
Right. Now there's training that we have within the Army to if somebody wants to be a historian, there's an identifier, additional skill identifier 5X. So if you can talk about what that is and what are the requirements.
Sure. The 5 X-ray additional skill identifier is an officer ASI for a historian. The program is administered by CMH, and we are the office in the Army who grants the 5X skill identifier to an individual who applies for it. And there are a number of ways, a number of routes to that additional skill identifier. Until a couple of years ago, the main requirement was for a master's degree in history. And so the pipeline was pretty small of officers who could gain and maintain a 5X additional skill identifier. Another way to obtain that identifier, though, is to take an elective at the Command and General Staff College. So as a major, you can take an elective on unit history operations at CGSC that will grant you the 5X additional skill identifier as well. Over the past few years, we have sought to expand the aperture, if you will, for the ASI to make it a little more applicable to a wider group of people. And we've begun to grant what we would really call sort of an apprentice level ASI 5X for officers who possess a bachelor's degree in history.
Okay.
So you can apply to CMH if you are an officer being commissioned out of the military academy or from ROTC or even OCS. If you have an undergraduate degree in history, we will grant you a 5X ASI. That ASI is useful in a couple of different ways. One, if you transition to the active or to the Army Reserve or to the National Guard, having that ASI is a fast route into a military history detachment assignment. The ASI is also a useful identifier for the Army to identify people for certain functional areas, for the Army Strategist Program, for attendance at the School of Advanced Military Studies, for particular assignments potentially at the Joint Staff level. It gives what we've done by expanding the pool of officers who have this ASI is I think we are doing a better job for the Army of identifying where talent exists in a particular area, and the Army can use these officers in particular ways. Whereas if they didn't, if you kept this identifier only with officers who had a master's degree in history, you're really not giving the Army the full view of people's talent.
Right. Yeah. And now, officers aside, what other training opportunities are there for NCOs or enlisted? So I know there's an A625 program and a new UHO distance learning training. So if you can talk to that.
Sure. Those are two courses that CMH runs that are distance learning courses that train individuals to function as a field or a command historian. So A625 is a distance learning course taught by CMH that is managed and sourced from the Command and General Staff College. And so that course is taught by one of our staff members, and it gives the student, over the course of a few months of distance learning instruction, the basics of setting up a unit historical program and functioning as a command historian. And so that's a little bit more in depth. We also run a distance learning course for those additional duty unit historical officers, which teaches them the basics of how to set up a unit historical file, and then also how to use the online tool set that we have developed to support unit historical officers. And this is available on our website, history.army.mil. Historical officers can use this tool to create a checklist for creating this historical file, and they can even use it to assemble a very basic unit historical summary. And so these courses are also open to NCOs, as you said, because we believe that a lot of units will use an NCO in that role of UHO, which is entirely within their capability. But then also keeping in mind that a significant part of the military history detachment complement are NCO positions. They are in the public affairs MOS, but they are NCOs who work in military history detachments. And so those courses are open to NCOs as well to give them those skill sets.
Well, as you know, I'm a public affairs officer, and every unit I was with had an MHD because the MHDs were 3 people. So they were usually attached to us or came under our purview. So I'm very, very familiar with that. But now you've talked several times about a unit historical file. So let's go a little bit more in depth on that. What does that consist of, and why are they important?
Well, I'll start with that second question. They're important, again, for the reasons that I talked about earlier, in that that a number of activities that a unit carries out on a daily basis depend on this knowledge of the unit's past. And I'm talking about, as I said, again, things like unit awards. I'm talking about lineage and honors, campaign participation credit, the battle streamers that a unit carries on its colors. But these records are also really important at an individual soldier level when you talk about retirement, transition from the service, and access to veterans benefits. Because one of the key parts of a veteran's process of gaining compensation, for example, for injuries sustained in a conflict, is applying official documentation of the Army's and the unit's presence in a theater of operations. And so the example I usually use is a soldier who was participating in a convoy in Iraq, is in an ambush. The unit is hit with an IED, and that soldier suffers a traumatic brain injury. That soldier, when it comes time to apply for veterans benefits for that disability sustained in combat, will have to document using official records the unit's presence in that theater at that time. And so those records come from unit historical files. And if units, broadly speaking, don't do this work of maintaining records of their past, these records are not accessible. And for the purposes of the Veterans Administration, the soldier may not be judged to have been in that theater of operations.
Wow.
And so this is an example of the very real impact that these files have. But back to the day-to-day of what constitutes a unit historical file. This is really a file of documents that tell the story of the unit's activities over time. And so, for example, it would include command biographies. When the unit changes command or when its senior NCOs change responsibility, you would keep a record of those by inserting, for example, the programs from changes of command. The biographies of commanders or senior NCOs would go into this file. Operations orders that govern the unit's deployments or training activities. After-action reviews of those same training activities. Public affairs articles on unit training events or activities. These are all types of information that would inhabit a unit historical file. So it's not, we try to demystify this a little bit with the unit historical officer program. We're not talking about writing historical documents.
Right.
We're not talking about doing long form narrative of unit activities. We're talking about assembling documents and think of it as a quilt. If a unit's, if the Army's history is a massive quilt, the quilts are made up of squares of fabric. If you think of unit histories as the squares that make up this quilt over time, within those squares, the threads of cloth that make up that square are these records. And it's in the more units that you have maintaining historical files of their records, the more complete the quilt is over time, and the easier it will be for the Army to dip into its own past and to use this information to make decisions. But then also it becomes much more effective and easy for historians to use the Army's records to write its own history in the future, or to allow scholars to write on the Army's history.
And these unit historical files, do they just stay locally at that unit? Do they get collected by their higher command, or do they come to the Center of Military History?
The answer is both. We encourage units to archive their historical files at their location, either digitally or in paper, because they're very useful at the unit level. But we also, through our support through our field and international programs division and our continual support and collaboration with unit historical officers and unit historians, we encourage them to send copies of these files to CMH. We have an upload feature that allows them to digitally send documents. They can send paper documents that we will archive as well. And so there's a strength in repetition and keeping them in different places.
And they can send that to the Center of Military History. Just go to our website.
They can.
History.army.mil.
That's right. And they'll find both email contact for our field programs division to speak with them about it, but then also mailing addresses and how to submit records and how to tie into our digital management systems as well.
Yeah, and one of the things, as somebody that answers a lot of questions from the public for the Center of Military History, the history of the units, it's a big morale boost, or esprit de corps within the units. People are always wanting to know information for their organization day, or a new commander is coming in, they want to put something together for it. So can you comment on any morale or esprit de corps types of activities that units will use their history for?
There are a couple that we recommend, and for the last several years, we've been publicizing these by briefing the Army's new battalion and brigade commanders at Fort Leavenworth. They run a course there several times a year that trains these new leaders of units. And so we brief them at Fort Leavenworth. And a couple of examples of unit historical activities that we believe have a good impact would be, for example, designating a unit day. And so we will work with units to dip into their history, their lineage and honors, and find a significant date on the calendar. It could be the date of the unit's activation. It could be a deployment to a war or conflict. It could be a date on which they earned a decoration for valor or a unit citation, or a particularly impactful date, and that date will become the unit day. We approve it. We give them a nice certificate that says this is your unit day. You can post it in the headquarters, but more importantly, you can do professional development activities around that date. It's useful in a variety of ways to build what I call a corporate mentality around being in the unit. because I tell the new commanders at Fort Leavenworth that I really passionately believe that this awareness of the unit's past makes for a more resilient unit, a unit that is capable of withstanding stress and hardship because they understand the lineage in which they serve, and the fact that the soldiers of previous generations were just like them. And if those soldiers served, sacrificed, excelled in different conflicts, the tools change, the environments change, but many of the essentials of soldiering don't change. And so an awareness of the unit's history through a thing like a unit day can be very effective. Another tool that we recommend is a set of so-called battle streamer briefs, where a unit can file these. Speaking of another thing that would be useful in a unit history file would be a series of these short briefings that a soldier, an officer, an NCO could give as a part of sergeant's time training, for example, or a unit organizational day, a briefing on the unit's activities that earned them this battle streamer. These are not really in-depth scholarly historical activities, so much as they are making use of the unit's past and research that's already happened.
Yeah, and it really builds a lot of pride in the unit itself, but also for people as a soldier.
It does.
Well, sir, is there anything else that you want to add that we didn't cover?
Yeah, I think I want to leave some thoughts with officers or NCOs in units who are listening to this, and this is really a plea for help and a call to action. When you look around the Army today, you don't see a lot of uniformed or civilian command historians in operating force units, and those are force structure decisions that have been made over time as units downsize, as they reorganize, as they inactivate, as they reactivate. It can be tempting to see this lack of a historical presence in the Army as evidence that history doesn't matter to the Army. I think you ask any senior leader, does the Army's history matter to us? They would tell you unanimously it does. And when you speak with soldiers, with officers, with NCOs, they know at an instinctual level that history matters. But we depend on officers to step up and to take pride and ownership in their own unit's past, and to accept the responsibility to future generations of developing this information, these files, and maintaining them and passing them on. So this is a plea for officers or NCOs to volunteer as unit historical officers. It's a plea for them to contact the Center of Military History and say, I'm going to appoint myself as the command historian for this brigade. I'm the brigade S1, for example, or I'm the brigade operations officer, I'm the assistant operations officer. I'm interested in the unit's past in Army's history. How can I set up a unit historical program? And we can guide them to do that. It doesn't mean that you have to have a degree in history. You don't have to have the 5X ASI, but you can take a part and ownership in your own unit's history. This is an area where you can really make a difference.
Sir, before we close, it's time for our segment called HUA Trivia. This is a piece of significant Army trivia that you can share about the role of unit historical programs or Army historians. So what do you have for us?
Yeah, I'll go back to June of 1944, and the place is Normandy Beach in France. The time is just after the D-Day landings, and in the days after the first wave hit the beach in France, the Army began deploying military history detachments. The Army had been training historians in 1942, 43, and 44, and what they did was they went out into the academic community, and they canvassed and they accepted applications for unit historians. They went to newspapers and the media. They found writers, correspondents, and they assigned and they formed military history detachments. And the first of these deployed in Normandy in 1944, and one of the members of this first detachment was a master sergeant named Forrest Pogue, and he is commemorated on one of the soldier story pylons outside of the new National Museum of the U.S. Army, and he was one of the first combat historians in the Army.
When you brought that up, made me think of the Monuments Man.
Absolutely.
Something similar, a similar program, but for historians, for command historians.
That's right.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Bowery, for your insights today about the role of Unit Army Historical Program and Army historians. And if anyone wants to learn more about the Unit Historical Program or learn more about Army history in general, I encourage you to explore our website at history.army.mil. And if you want to experience Army history every day, then visit our social media sites on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So thanks for joining us today on the United States Army History and Heritage Podcast. For the Center of Military History, I'm Lee Reynolds, and until next time, we're history.
The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or opinions of the U.S. Army or Department of Defense. For more information about the Army's proud history and heritage, go to history.army.mil.